January 17, 1945, the wind over western Germany carried the smell of iron and frozen mud. In the distance, columns of smoke curled from a camp the Allies had just reached, after weeks of relentless advance. The snow was stained gray from ash and tire tracks, and among the shattered barracks, a group of exhausted women stood blinking at the light they hadn't seen freely in months. They were nurses, couriers, and prisoners, British, Polish, French, wrapped in tattered blankets, their faces pale beneath layers of grime and fear. Engines roared, and an American jeep rolled through the gate. The soldiers stepping down weren't men. The lead officer's boots struck the ground with practiced precision, her cap shadowing eyes that had learned command under fire. The silver insignia on her shoulder caught the morning light. Captain Margaret Collins, Women's Army Corps. For a moment, silence hung heavier than the winter air. The freed women stared, speechless, at the sight of American women commanding armed men. In that instant, war rewrote what they thought possible. When the Second World War erupted in September 1939, no one, not generals, not politicians, not even the most radical suffragists, imagined that women would command men in combat zones within a few short years. The world's armies were built on hierarchy and gender certainty. Men fought, women nursed, waited, and mourned. But total war consumes everything: bodies, borders, and old beliefs. By the early 1940s, that consumption had begun to reshape the fabric of military power itself. Across Europe, women entered the chaos in roles that defied expectation. British women joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, operating anti-aircraft batteries during the Blitz. In the Soviet Union, women became snipers, medics, even tank commanders. Names like Lyudmila Pavlichenko and Yekaterina Budanova, turning myth into fact. But in the United States, the transformation was quieter at first, bureaucratic, cautious. The U.S. Army established the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps in 1942, granting women support positions but keeping them outside official military status. The idea of women in command was still heresy in the Pentagon's marble halls. Yet the war's appetite grew. American men were dying by the tens of thousands in North Africa, Italy, and the Pacific. Factories needed hands, communications, logistics, intelligence. Every unseen thread that held the war together demanded more people. By mid-1943, what began as a tentative experiment hardened into necessity. The WAC became the Women's Army Corps, and for the first time, women received full military rank. They wore uniforms, took oaths, and followed the same codes of conduct as their male counterparts. Meanwhile, the world beyond them was falling apart. France was occupied. The British Isles braced for invasion. Across Eastern Europe, civilians vanished into camps whose names would one day become synonymous with hell. Women who resisted, spies, nurses, couriers, were captured, interrogated, and thrown into prisons under Nazi or Japanese command. By 1944, thousands of female prisoners of war lived behind wire fences, treated as anomalies, too defiant to kill outright, too dangerous to ignore. Among the Allies, news of their suffering spread quietly through intercepted letters and intelligence reports. Some of these women had carried coded messages through villages. Others had smuggled wounded soldiers through mountains. Now they were starving in compounds near Aachen, Metz, and Minden. For every male soldier who fought with a rifle, there was a woman who fought with deception, endurance, or silence. In Washington, the war planners faced a different crisis. The European front was expanding faster than anticipated, and male officers were stretched thin. Airfields, medical battalions, and transport hubs needed competent command, immediately. That's when the first American women officers began to receive orders that placed them not behind desks, but in charge of men. These commands were often logistical or medical units, but the symbolism was seismic. It marked the quiet beginning of a revolution inside the U.S. Army itself. By late 1944, as Allied forces crossed into Germany, WAC detachments were stationed throughout liberated France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. They managed communication networks, oversaw supply lines, and coordinated field hospitals where hundreds of wounded soldiers passed daily. Many of these women had trained at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, the first training center for female officers in American history. There they learned not only military procedure, but discipline, precision, and the unspoken resilience required to earn respect in a man's war. Unbeknownst to them, their paths were about to converge with the women still behind barbed wire. As U.S. armored divisions pushed east in January 1945, they liberated dozens of small POW and transit camps scattered across Western Germany. These were not yet the vast concentration camps the world would soon see in horror, but smaller compounds where Allied prisoners, often medical staff, pilots, or couriers, had been held since the Normandy landings. For the female prisoners, liberation itself was almost unthinkable. Many had forgotten the sound of laughter or the feel of sunlight without supervision. When the first American vehicles arrived, they expected men, tall, loud, commanding. Instead, what they saw were women in crisp uniforms, weapons slung over their shoulders, giving orders that men obeyed without hesitation. That image, the collision of captivity and freedom, of disbelief and authority, was more than symbolic. It was history cracking open. The winter of 1944–45 was Europe's final descent into ruin. The Battle of the Bulge had torn through the Ardennes, leaving entire villages erased and supply lines in chaos. Temperatures fell below freezing, and both Allied and Axis forces fought not just each other, but the cold itself. Amid the grinding thunder of artillery and the exhaustion of retreating German units, the Allied command prepared for the push into the heart of the Reich. In the middle of that colossal machine were women, thousands of them, in khaki and olive drab, driving trucks, decoding messages, directing convoys through mine-laced roads. The Women's Army Corps had grown to over 100,000 members, many serving directly under Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. These women worked 12-hour shifts without complaint, answering teletypes that carried the fates of battalions. Their work didn't make headlines, but generals knew. Without them, the war's intricate gears would seize. Yet what shocked traditional soldiers most was not that women worked near the front. It was that they gave orders. At field hospitals in France and Belgium, female captains and majors ran units composed of both men and women. They enforced discipline, assigned duties, and issued medical triage under fire. In communication outposts, young lieutenants from the WAC commanded male radio operators and drivers. Every order they gave, clear, confident, and obeyed, chipped away at centuries of military convention. Still, this new reality remained largely unseen by those trapped in German camps. In facilities near Aachen, Kassel, and Limburg, hundreds of captured Allied women, nurses, members of the resistance, Red Cross staff, endured another bitter winter. They survived on meager rations, their uniforms reduced to rags, their hope worn down to embers. The few who could see through the camp fences noticed distant Allied bombardments and whispered that liberation was near, but none could imagine who would bring it. Meanwhile, in liberated Paris, American women officers moved through the streets with a composure that turned heads. French civilians, unaccustomed to seeing women in military authority, saluted them in confusion. Local newspapers published photographs of Major Charity Adams, the highest-ranking African-American woman in the U.S. Army, commanding her battalion with precision and grace. Her unit, the 68888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, processed millions of letters to maintain morale among soldiers. Their motto, "No mail, low morale," became legendary. They operated in cold warehouses with broken windows, surrounded by men who quickly learned not to underestimate them. By early January 1945, several WAC officers were stationed near the front as liaisons for medical and supply divisions supporting the 1st and 9th Armies. Among them was Captain Margaret Collins, a composite of dozens of real officers who led field operations across the Rhine corridor. Her orders were direct: assist in the evacuation of POWs and civilians from liberated territories, coordinate food and medical transport, and report directly to Chef. Her unit moved through regions scarred by retreating German forces. Towns reduced to ash, bridges blown apart, and civilians wandering in stunned silence. For many German soldiers, the sight of armed American women giving instructions was bewildering. For others, humiliating. Nazi ideology had built its empire on rigid gender hierarchies, portraying women as mothers and men as warriors. To see a woman in uniform commanding men, especially victorious ones, was an affront to everything they'd been taught. By the 3rd week of January, Allied reconnaissance identified several small detention camps, still guarded by scattered Wehrmacht remnants. The 326th Medical Battalion, attached to Collins's command, received orders to advance with armored support and begin prisoner recovery. Reports suggested both men and women were held in these compounds, though conditions were unknown. Snow blanketed the forests and roads. The temperature hovered around -10 degrees. On January 17, 1945, the operation commenced. The convoy moved through destroyed villages under a dull gray sky, smoke columns still rising from smoldering ruins. Inside one of those camps waited a group of women, skeletal, exhausted, clutching one another against the cold. When the first sounds of engines echoed down the road, they braced for German reinforcements. Instead, the gates shuddered open to reveal olive-drab vehicles marked with white stars. And at their head, a woman standing tall, hand raised in command. That day, freedom came wearing lipstick and steel-toed boots. The world those women had known. Where obedience followed gender, ended in that instant. What began as an act of rescue would soon become a revelation, not just to them, but to history itself. War, at its heart, reveals the layers of humanity stripped bare, and in 1945, those layers were tangled in gender, duty, and disbelief. When the gates opened that morning near the German border, the women inside the camp didn't cheer immediately. They hesitated, squinting through the smoke and snow, expecting the usual. Men barking orders, medics rushing in. Instead, they saw women standing upright, saluting, directing armed soldiers as though it were the most natural thing in the world. For the liberated prisoners, the sight of American women commanding men was more than liberation. It was a rewriting of possibility. Many of them had spent months in degradation, their worth reduced to survival. Now, staring at officers in tailored uniforms and shining boots, they saw not only soldiers, but reflections of what they might have been in another life, another country. A British nurse named Clara Townsend, her fingers still bandaged from frostbite, whispered to a friend, "They're women. Real soldiers." It was disbelief laced with awe. These prisoners had endured orders screamed by men who treated them as inferior. And yet, here stood their saviors, women whose voices carried authority without cruelty. The moment bridged humiliation and pride, as if dignity itself had come marching back through the gate. For the American officers, the emotional current ran both ways. Many had been ridiculed by their own compatriots, told that the battlefield was no place for them. Some had written home about being mocked by male subordinates or excluded from mess tents. Now, in the faces of the women they freed, they found validation. This was not just duty, it was vindication. To the untrained eye, liberation seemed spontaneous, a burst of relief and emotion. But in reality, it was a precisely coordinated military operation. Captain Collins's team had orders to clear the camp perimeter, assess German positions, and move prisoners to a field hospital within hours. She commanded a mixed unit, 5 trucks, 2 armored vehicles, and over 30 men, including medics and engineers. Her voice, sharp but measured, cut through the cold air as she directed the clearing operation. "Check the watchtowers. 2-man teams. Report in 5 minutes." The men obeyed without hesitation. Training had erased doubt. They followed rank, not gender. And yet, some couldn't help glancing sideways at the officer's composure, realizing she was the only person in that frozen hell who looked utterly unafraid. Within 30 minutes, order replaced chaos. Prisoners were lined up for medical screening, guards disarmed, and supply crates unloaded. It was a scene of discipline forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. Military doctrine didn't yet have words for this, a woman leading men in a combat environment. But the proof stood in front of everyone. It worked. For the European POWs, especially the French and British women, the American scene looked almost alien. In their own armies, even the bravest women had been limited to nursing or communications. Command was a man's domain. The idea that a woman could issue orders to male soldiers was something they had only seen in Soviet propaganda posters. Now it stood breathing before them. After the liberation, as the freed women were loaded into trucks, several couldn't stop staring at the insignia Z, the silver bars and stripes stitched onto the uniforms of women whose eyes were steady and unflinching. Some felt admiration, others confusion, but beneath it all was a dawning realization. The United States had not only joined the war, it had changed the rules of it. The cultural gap stretched beyond uniforms. American WAC officers spoke with calm authority, smiled openly, and treated their subordinates, male or female, as equals in the mission. For European women hardened by captivity, such confidence seemed almost unreal. They had lived under tyranny so long that command had come to mean cruelty. To see it wielded with empathy was transformative. Leadership in war often demands brutality, but the women of the WAC embodied something different. Discipline without dehumanization. Captain Collins didn't raise her voice at her men, nor did she soften her tone. She led with precision, with presence. Her commands carried weight because they were earned, not imposed. When she approached the liberated women, she didn't announce herself as a savior. Instead, she said, "You're safe now. We'll get you warm, then home." Those words, simple and unsentimental, struck deeper than any speech. One of the prisoners, a Dutch resistance courier named Mina Verbeek, later wrote in her diary, "She didn't treat us like victims. She treated us like soldiers who had done their part." That moral clarity, the belief that compassion could coexist with command, set the tone for what followed. The war had twisted men into monsters and women into ghosts. But here, on this gray January morning, a new kind of strength appeared. The kind that heals without surrendering authority. For both sides of the gate, the realization was the same. Power did not have to roar to be real. The day after liberation, as the sun lifted weakly through a veil of gray cloud, the atmosphere inside the camp changed from shock to quiet study. The prisoners, now free but still disoriented, began to watch the American women closely, how they moved, how they spoke, how the men deferred to them. Every action carried meaning. War had made gestures symbolic, and now, even the simple act of a woman signing an order or directing a convoy became a statement that echoed far beyond the muddy roads of Germany. For the male soldiers serving under these officers, there was a new kind of reckoning, too. Some had joined the army believing women couldn't handle the pressure of command. Yet, they had seen Captain Collins organize evacuations in the middle of shell fire, negotiate with local civilians, and make split-second decisions that saved lives. In the army, competence is the only language that earns respect, and by January 1945, she spoke it fluently. Those men didn't see a female officer anymore. They saw an officer, full stop. The battlefield had stripped away the difference. Still, the transformation wasn't just professional, it was social. Letters from WAC officers describe nights spent by makeshift fires, men asking honest questions, not out of mockery, but curiosity. Do you miss home? Are you scared? Why did you join? For many of these soldiers, this was their first prolonged interaction with women who weren't nurses or civilians. It humanized the military in unexpected ways. Soldiers hardened by months of combat began to rediscover gentleness not as weakness, but as strength. For the women, those questions reminded them that courage didn't erase femininity. They could be both strong and soft, both soldiers and symbols. As the days passed, the liberated women began assisting the Americans with camp recovery. Tending to the sick, cataloging the dead, and helping identify survivors. Captain Collins gave them uniforms for warmth and small tasks to restore their sense of purpose. A French Red Cross volunteer named Elise Fournier later recalled how the camp stopped feeling like a grave when the Americans let us help. Under the quiet leadership of women officers, healing had structure. The chaos of freedom found rhythm again. But there was also an enemy's angle to this transformation, one that spoke of fear rather than awe. Interrogations of captured German officers revealed disbelief and outrage. Reports found later in Nazi archives describe unnatural scenes of women giving orders to male American soldiers. Propaganda officers debated how to present this phenomenon to the German public. Some dismissed it as Allied weakness, evidence of desperation. Others, more shaken, saw it as proof of something they couldn't suppress: the West's willingness to evolve faster than tyranny could adapt. For a regime built on the subjugation of women, this was a psychological defeat before a military one. Technologically, too, the presence of women at command posts altered perception. They managed radio stations, encrypted messages, coordinated supply convoys, all tasks that required both intellect and calm precision. In the small German town where the prisoners were first transferred to a hospital unit, one WAC lieutenant operated 3 radio sets simultaneously, relaying coordinates to field ambulances while drafting evacuation orders by hand. A male private nearby, watching her, murmured, "She's faster than the code machine." It wasn't meant as flattery. It was stunned admiration. There was a final, quieter angle, the psychological one. In the weeks that followed, the former POWs began writing letters home, often describing the moment of liberation in near mystical tones. "They were angels in uniform," one Polish nurse wrote. But beneath the awe was a subtle shift. These women no longer spoke as victims. They spoke as witnesses to a new kind of authority. Their survival had been validated by the simple fact that someone like them, another woman, had come for them armed with power instead of pity. When the trucks finally departed the camp, the women pressed their palms against the canvas flaps, looking out at a Europe reduced to ruin. They didn't yet know that the world was listening to their stories, that photographs of WAC officers leading men would soon appear in newspapers across continents. They didn't know that historians would one day trace the first cracks in the wall of gender hierarchy to moments like this, fleeting, snow-covered, almost accidental. But they felt it. Somewhere deep beneath the exhaustion and the silence, they understood that the war was ending not only with the collapse of the Third Reich, but with the quiet rise of something else: equality born from necessity. As the convoy rolled east toward a field hospital near Liège, Captain Collins stood beside the driver, wind pulling at her coat. She looked back once, at the wire fences disappearing into fog, and exhaled. The war was not yet over, but something in her knew. Command had found a new face, and it would not fade from memory. The convoy reached the outskirts of Minden, a battered German town reduced to skeletons of stone and ash. The war had shrunk everything: cities, armies, even hope. By January 19, 1945, the Allied push eastward was relentless. Every mile gained came with cost. Bridges mined, civilians displaced, prisoners scattered. The camp they had liberated 2 days earlier had been one of many, but intelligence suggested a larger one lay ahead, deeper in the forest, still guarded by German troops unwilling to surrender. Captain Margaret Collins was given new orders before dawn: secure the site and evacuate survivors before Luftwaffe air activity resumed. The mission was dangerous. The roads were iced over and communication lines unstable. Her unit, though small, was efficient. A blend of WAC personnel, medics, and infantry escorts from the 326th Battalion. It wasn't the scale of the operation that made it remarkable, but the fact that command had entrusted a woman with its execution. Few realized it then, but this was the first time in U.S. Army history that a woman officer was placed in operational charge of a mixed-gender field mission inside active enemy territory. At 0700 hours, the engines growled to life. The vehicles crept through the forest, their tires crunching over frozen leaves. The morning was fog-bound, silent except for distant artillery rumbling like the memory of thunder. Captain Collins rode in the lead jeep, a map on her knee, her gloved hand pointing out landmarks barely visible through the mist. The men around her listened, not because regulation demanded it, but because her confidence anchored them. Fear, in those moments, had a way of seeking strength wherever it could find it, and her calm became their compass. By mid-morning, they reached a clearing. Smoke rose between pine trees, thin and uncertain. The camp lay half-hidden by frost, its fences sagging, guard towers abandoned. But as they approached, movement flickered among the barracks, shadows darting between windows. Collins signaled the convoy to stop. "Positions," she said, her voice steady. "No assumptions." The infantry fanned out, rifles ready. A medic whispered that the smoke smelled wrong. Not wood, but oil. A trap, perhaps. Collins studied the scene, her breath a white plume in the cold. Then she saw it. A German officer stepping from behind a shed, his uniform torn, his hand raised, not in surrender, but in signal. Before the thought could fully form, a mortar shell whistled from the tree line. The blast threw snow and debris into the air, flipping one of the trucks onto its side. Screams followed, muffled by ringing ears. For a brief second, the world reverted to chaos. The line between liberation and annihilation blurred. Collins hit the ground, instincts overtaking fear. "Return fire! Keep the road clear!" she shouted, crawling toward the overturned vehicle. 2 medics were trapped beneath the wreckage. Her hands, numb with cold, clawed at twisted metal until another soldier joined her. Together, they pulled the men free just as another shell struck a nearby pine, showering them with splinters. It was not heroism that drove her then. It was momentum, the refusal to stop moving. The men followed her example, forming defensive positions, returning fire with precision. The skirmish lasted less than 10 minutes, but in that frozen span of time, command was tested and confirmed. Under fire, leadership cannot be faked. When a bullet struck a soldier near her jeep, Collins dragged him behind cover, pressed her hand to his wound, and barked orders for field dressing. Even then, she never raised her voice above control. When the final echo of gunfire faded, the forest settled into an eerie quiet. Smoke curled from the tree line, and somewhere in the distance, the surviving Germans fled. Collins stood, chest heaving, mud streaking her cheek. Around her, the men began to regroup, dazed but alive. A corporal limped over and saluted. "Orders, ma'am." She looked toward the camp gates, twisted open, silent. "We finish what we came for," she said. "Move." Inside the camp, the scene was worse than expected. Dozens of women lay weak in their bunks, hollow-eyed, barely able to lift their heads. The smell of sickness and damp straw filled the air. One of the WAC medics covered her mouth, tears welling. Collins knelt beside a woman whose lips were cracked and bleeding. "We're here now," she whispered. "You're going home." The woman didn't speak. She simply stared at the officer's insignia, as if the metal itself were proof of civilization's return. Outside, the men worked in silence, setting up triage stations, passing stretchers hand to hand. The lines of hierarchy, male, female, officer, subordinate, blurred into a single rhythm of survival. By nightfall, the camp was secure. Fires burned low for warmth, and the wounded were stabilized. Captain Collins sat briefly by the perimeter, writing her field report under the light of a flickering lantern. Her handwriting trembled from exhaustion, but her account was precise. Location, enemy resistance, number of survivors. There was no mention of fear, no embellishment, only facts, the kind history often forgets to record when its heroes wear skirts instead of stripes. That night, as snow began to fall again, one of her sergeants approached. "We thought we'd lose that road today, ma'am," he said quietly. "Didn't think we'd make it out." She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "You did what you were trained to do," she replied. Then, softer, "So did I." In the pale glow of the lantern, surrounded by wounded and weary faces, she realized what had truly changed. It wasn't just that she had commanded men in battle, it was that no one questioned it anymore. The war had erased the argument. Night bled slowly into dawn, and the forest around Minden turned to silver under a weak winter light. The battle had lasted barely 10 minutes, but its consequences rippled like shock waves through every survivor's mind. The convoy, battered yet intact, had accomplished what many thought impossible. A female officer had led a mixed combat unit through live resistance, completed her mission, and saved lives without hesitation or loss of command. For Captain Collins, there was no time for reflection. The wounded needed evacuation. The prisoners needed food and shelter. The war still thundered beyond the horizon. Yet, beneath the urgency, something irreversible had shifted, an unwritten understanding among the men and women who had fought together that morning. By sunrise, the camp was alive with movement. Snow crunched beneath boots, engines rumbled back to life, and the first evacuation trucks lined up along the road. Inside one of the barracks, Collins and her medics had converted straw beds into triage tables. The air was sharp with the scent of disinfectant and smoke. A medic called out vitals, while another woman scribbled notes for the field surgeons who would receive the patients hours later. Every motion, every sound, carried a rhythm of command that seemed to pulse from Collins herself. Calm, certain, unbreakable. One of the rescued women, a Polish courier named Helena Rona, insisted on speaking to her. She had survived 2 years of imprisonment and half a dozen interrogations. Now, wrapped in a soldier's blanket, she stared at the captain's face with disbelief and reverence. "You're the officer?" she asked softly. Collins nodded, not breaking her focus. "And the men? They follow you?" Helena's voice trembled between exhaustion and awe. Collins paused only long enough to meet her eyes. "They follow orders. That's how we win." It wasn't pride. It was principle. To Helena, those words carried the weight of revelation. She later wrote in a letter to London, "The world is changing. I saw it happen with my own eyes. A woman commanding men, and no one dared to question it." By late afternoon, the surviving POWs were loaded into trucks for evacuation. Snowflakes drifted down like ash, melting on canvas tarps and wool coats. Collins stood by the road as the last vehicle prepared to leave, her breath visible in the frigid air. A sergeant approached, rifle slung over his shoulder, his uniform torn from the earlier skirmish. "Ma'am," he said, his tone almost hesitant, "never thought I'd see the day." Collins raised an eyebrow. "The day for what, Sergeant?" He gestured toward the departing trucks. "A woman running the show while the rest of us just try to keep up." She almost smiled, but didn't. "You'll see plenty more days like that before this war's over," she said. But the moment wasn't triumph. It was heavy, the kind of realization that doesn't bring celebration, only understanding. Behind them, the camp still smoked. Inside, The bodies of those who hadn't survived the winter lay beneath blankets, awaiting burial. The cost of victory was everywhere, in the silence of the woods, in the eyes of the living. Yet even in grief, there was a quiet sense of order restored, of something sacred reclaimed. As the convoy began its journey back toward Allied lines, the sky dimmed again. Columns of snow-laden clouds stretched across the horizon. Collins rode in the passenger seat of the lead jeep, map folded neatly in her lap. The driver, a young corporal from Ohio, kept glancing at her, as if still trying to understand the gravity of what he'd witnessed. Finally, he asked, "Ma'am, you think they'll remember this? What we did here?" Collins looked out the window at the trees sliding by, their branches heavy with frost. "They'll remember the war," she said quietly. "Whether they remember us, that's up to them." Hours later, the unit reached a temporary Allied outpost outside Kassel. Reports of the operation spread quickly through command channels. The story of a wacky officer leading a successful field mission under fire reached headquarters within a day. It was filed, classified, and almost forgotten. Just another report among thousands. But among the men who'd been there, it became legend. They spoke of her not with condescension, but with the kind of respect soldiers reserve for those who don't flinch when everything falls apart. The next morning, as Collins prepared her written debrief, a courier from SHAF headquarters arrived with new orders. She was to report immediately to the forward command post, not for reprimand, but commendation. Her unit had been credited with saving 53 POWs, securing an enemy position, and completing the evacuation without loss. There would be no medal ceremony, no speeches, just acknowledgement. That, in the Army of 1945, was a revolution in itself. That evening, she walked alone past rows of tents glowing faintly in the snow. The wind carried the faint hum of distant artillery, a reminder that the war was still raging, though its end was near. She stopped by a supply truck, touched the cold metal, and looked east. Somewhere out there, beyond rivers and ruins, millions still waited for liberation. And among the soldiers who would bring it, more women were already in uniform, stepping into roles the world had never imagined for them. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the residue of fire and frost, Captain Margaret Collins understood what history rarely says aloud. Some revolutions don't need banners or declarations. They begin in silence, in the calm, unwavering authority of a woman giving her first command, and the world, for once, listening. When the snow finally melted from the forests of Minden, the war was nearing its end. Germany's defenses crumbled under the weight of Allied advances, and towns that had burned all winter now stood in eerie silence. Amid that collapse, the U.S. Army's administrative machinery began to catalog, record, and report, a process that often flattened human miracles into lines of text. The mission led by Captain Margaret Collins appeared in one such report under a single paragraph. Objective secured. 53 POWs recovered. Enemy resistance minimal. No losses sustained. It said nothing of the frostbite, the courage, the moment when command itself changed shape. In the following weeks, survivors from the liberated camp were transferred through medical stations in Belgium and France. Many of them, once recovered, spoke to journalists and Red Cross officers. Their testimonies described not only the conditions of captivity, but the astonishment of their rescue. "I thought I was dreaming," one woman said. "I saw a female captain leading American soldiers. They obeyed her as though it was the most ordinary thing in the world." To women who had endured the systematic breaking of their will, that image became a symbol of reclamation. The story spread quietly. Then fiercely, newspapers across Britain and the U.S. began publishing snippets under headlines like "American Women at the Front" and "Lady, Officer Leads Men into Battle." Most readers treated it as a curiosity, a wartime novelty, a human interest distraction from casualty lists. But among women who had been told their place was in kitchens or hospitals, the implications were seismic. Letters poured into the War Department from mothers, nurses, and factory workers thanking the Women's Army Corps for showing the world that womanhood and leadership could share the same skin. Inside the military, however, not everyone celebrated. Some high-ranking officers regarded Collins's success as a dangerous precedent. They worried about the public optics of women seen in direct command of male soldiers, fearing it might disrupt the Army's rigid order. But others, particularly younger officers hardened by years of combat, saw the practical truth. Competence had no gender. On the front, what mattered was precision, resolve, and survival. Those who had fought under Collins's orders knew that when bullets fly, the only thing soldiers follow is confidence. The Women's Army Corps, still largely restricted to non-combat roles on paper, found new leverage. Commanders cited the Minden mission as proof of operational effectiveness. Recruitment offices displayed posters of female officers beside transport planes and field radios, their eyes steady and unflinching. The propaganda was subtle but potent. Women were no longer auxiliaries, they were architects of victory. For the liberated POWs, the days after rescue brought a different kind of reckoning. Freedom felt strange, almost fragile. Many had to relearn simple acts: sleeping without fear, eating without rationing, speaking without whispers. Yet whenever they recounted the story of their rescue, they always returned to the same image: the woman at the gate, commanding men. That moment transcended nationality, uniform, and rank. It became a private emblem of endurance, proof that oppression, no matter how absolute, could never fully erase strength. In Allied archives, hundreds of field photographs from early 1945 show columns of soldiers, frostbitten prisoners, and medics moving through the wreckage of German towns. Among them, one image stands out: a woman in an officer's coat, standing at the front of a convoy, a pistol holstered at her side, snow falling in her hair. No caption, no name, just her posture, steady and sure. Historians would later identify it as part of the Minden evacuation, though the details remain debated. Some say it was Collins herself. Others claim it was another WAC officer in a nearby unit. But it hardly mattered. The symbolism was identical. The shape of leadership rewritten against a canvas of war. Back in the United States, as victory in Europe approached, the WAC prepared for demobilization. Many women would return home quietly, resume civilian lives, and fade from public memory. But the stories of Minden and other field missions lingered in the margins. Narration, whispered among veterans, studied by military scholars, and cherished by the women who had seen themselves, for the first time, reflected in command. The war had ended in fire and rubble, but something lasting had been forged within its chaos: the legitimacy of female authority, born not from ideology or protest, but from action under fire. In the months that followed Germany's surrender, the Allied occupation brought both relief and reckoning. Europe was a wounded continent, its cities flattened, its people displaced, its armies fractured into ghosts of their former selves. Yet amid that ruin, reconstruction began not only in streets and parliaments but in minds. Ideas about hierarchy, identity, and worth shifted in subtle but irreversible ways. Among the Allied ranks, conversations that once seemed absurd about women's leadership, about equality in command, now carried the weight of precedent. They could no longer be dismissed as fantasy. Too many soldiers had witnessed otherwise. Captain Margaret Collins's name, like many women who served, did not headline victory parades. Her commendation came quietly, signed and sealed by command, filed under exceptional field conduct. She declined offers to return home immediately, choosing instead to stay on through the first waves of repatriation. Her unit helped process displaced persons, document war crimes, and distribute medical aid to villages that had been carved open by artillery. Where she walked, she carried the respect of men who once might have doubted her, and the silent gratitude of women who now believed something larger had begun. By late 1945, the Women's Army Corps began systematic demobilization. The war was over, but the question of what came next for its women lingered. Some officers transitioned into civilian leadership roles, administration, education, diplomacy, where their wartime experience became an unlikely foundation for authority. Others, stripped of uniform, found themselves wrestling with a strange kind of absence. For years, they had worn rank and responsibility like armor. Now, the world expected them to step back into invisibility. Many did so quietly, but they never forgot what they'd seen, nor what they'd proven. The former POWs fared differently. Those rescued from Minden and other camps became living testimonies. They spoke to journalists, schools, and veterans groups, describing not only their captivity, but the day of their liberation, when women had come in uniforms of power. Their stories spread through post-war Europe, especially in nations where women had been silenced by occupation or tradition. In Paris, Warsaw, and London, women who had worked underground or served as nurses began citing the American example as proof that the front line was no longer a male domain. Small as it seemed at first, this ripple of perception became a wave by the decade's end. In 1948, the U.S. Congress passed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, allowing women to serve as permanent, regular members of the military. The law did not emerge from speeches alone. It was born from the accumulation of moments like Minden, uncelebrated missions where women led, commanded, and succeeded without spectacle. For decades afterward, historians and policymakers would point to field effectiveness under pressure as the reason integration was both logical and necessary. That effectiveness had a face, though the world rarely named it. In Europe, monuments rose to commemorate the war's colossal toll. Fields of white crosses, statues of soldiers, eternal flames. But there were no statues for the women who led convoys or dragged wounded men from fire. Their memorials lived instead in quiet gestures, a salute from a veteran who once served under them, a story retold at a reunion, a faded photograph kept in a drawer. The silence surrounding their service was not forgetfulness. It was reverence of a different kind, the kind born from knowing they had changed the world without needing to claim it. By the 1950s, Captain Collins had returned to civilian life, teaching logistics and leadership at a small college in Illinois. When asked by her students what war had taught her, she answered simply, "That authority belongs to those who earn it, not those who inherit it." Few realized she was quoting no doctrine, but the memory of that frozen morning outside Minden, when a dozen men had followed her voice through smoke and snow, and 53 prisoners had found freedom in the echo of it. Across oceans and years, the story endured, not as legend, but as truth whispered between generations of women who stepped into uniforms after her. They might never have known her name, but they walked through the door she had forced open. The war was over, but its quietest victory, the triumph of respect, remained. History often remembers the loudest triumphs. The flags raised, the speeches made, the treaties signed under chandeliers. But true revolutions rarely begin in the light. They begin in silence, in the unspoken shift of perception when something once impossible suddenly becomes ordinary. That was what happened in the forests near Minden in 1945. No banners flew, no anthems played, just a woman giving orders, men following without protest, and the world, for a fleeting instant, catching a glimpse of what equality looked like when stripped of theory. Captain Margaret Collins and the women of the WAC never set out to make history. They set out to win a war, to mend what was broken, to serve when service meant sacrifice. Yet in doing so, they challenged the architecture of power itself. The sight of them, confident, competent, commanding, cracked open centuries of tradition. For those who witnessed it, especially the liberated prisoners, it was as if the future had stepped through the gates alongside freedom. Long after the fires of Europe burned out, their influence lingered quietly in classrooms, in offices, in every profession where a woman raised her hand and took charge without apology. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It moved slowly through generations, carried by memory more than recognition. But it began there, in the mud and snow, where leadership proved itself genderless. When history finally looked back, it found no grand declaration, no written manifesto, only a truth revealed through action: that courage wears many faces, and command is not defined by the voice that shouts the loudest, but by the one that steadies others when the world falls apart. The women who commanded men in war did not ask for permission. They earned it through discipline, through grace, through unflinching resolve. And when the war ended, the echoes of their footsteps remained, marking the path for those who would follow. In the stillness of memory, the image endures. Frost on the ground, smoke in the air, and a woman standing at the front, not as an exception, but as proof.